Good morning and welcome to Kalapriya's second Cultural Sundays program. I am Antara Nath Rivera, and as a new member of the Board of Directors at the Kalapriya Foundation, I am delighted to introduce today's program. Kalapriya's mission is to present India's artistic diversity through the performing arts of dance, music, theater, and storytelling, and preserve traditional South Asian art forms. The music of our first Cultural Sundays program was inspired by civil rights leaders Mahatma Gandhi and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In this program, we recognize that ancient epics are still relevant to today's dilemmas. In March, we will celebrate Women's History Month by focusing on the depiction of South Asian women through art. In April, we will be showcasing vibrant classical dances of India performed by various artists. Donations make this kind of free programming possible. If you have not had a chance to donate, please use the link in the chat box. I am honored to introduce our presenters for today. Our host will be Dr. Gauri Ramnarayan. Dr. Ramnarayan has been a master storyteller all her life. Kalapriya has been fortunate to have her as an advisor and as a presenter of her creative productions since 2016. Dr. Ramnarayan worked as a journalist at the newspaper The Hindu for over 2 decades. She continues to be a freelance journalist for several major news outlets. In 2019, she directed Kalapriya's creative collaboration with the Chicago Children's Choir titled I Sing for Change. Today, she will lay out the story and the characters of the key episode in the Mahabharata. She will then lead the discussion with our talented and diverse young panelists. Our panelists today are Daniel Epstein, Arjun Jaykumar, and Dr. Srikanth Reddy. Daniel Epstein is an attorney and a former candidate for the Supreme Court of Illinois. Daniel has provided pro bono representations for many in various state courts in Illinois, all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Daniel has advocated for solutions to problems from institutional bias in the justice system to how pseudoscience in the courtroom leads to false verdicts. Arjun Jaykumar also maintains an active pro bono practice in which he has represented human trafficking victims, low-income families seeking public benefits, asylum seekers, and Title VII plaintiffs alleging race-based employment discrimination. Dr. Srikanth Reddy is an author, a poet, and a professor. He is with us today from the far coast of British Columbia. In 2005, he received the Asian American Literary Award for poetry. He is currently a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Chicago. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our host, Dr. Gauri Ramnarayan. Thank you.
Namaste. Friends, may I begin by thanking Kalapriya and its dynamic president, Mridu Shekhar, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. And thanks to all the members of Kalapriya and the superb tech team of today, which has made this event happen. Today, I am going to talk about the most challenging moment in every single person's life. The moment we have to make a decision about right and wrong. The moment we are forced to take a stand on our values. How am I going to do that? By retelling an old story dispassionately without any comments or assessments, so that you and our distinguished panelists here are free to make their own assessments about the moral dilemmas raised in this story. I'm looking forward to your comments. Now, say the great Indian epic, and you say the Mahabharata. You say Mahabharata, and you say the great dynastic struggle. The struggle for the throne of Hastinapura between the royal cousins of the Kuru dynasty, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. This struggle culminates in a fratricidal war. Now, the sage Vyasa is supposed to be the author of the Mahabharata, but we know that the Mahabharata grew and evolved between 400 BCE and 4th century CE. It grew into the longest epic in the world. Hold your breath. 1.8 million words. And the epic is 10 times as long as the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. The main story of the Mahabharata and all those zillion stories within stories which are kind of tucked into it, they have constantly inspired Indian writers in every region and every language for centuries. Right till the present moment. I too plead guilty. I have also written a play about the Mahabharata, about a single nuclear family trying to survive against a disintegrating world. Sounds familiar? Now, why does the epic remain relevant to us? Why does it remain relevant to us in every age, ancient and modern? Because I think it supplies us with innumerable ethical dilemmas, no solutions. You are free to arrive at your own solutions. What the epic does is to hold up a mirror reflecting your own conscience. We come face to face with our own courage, with our own cowardice, and we are forced to take a decision about our moral values, our problems. Today, I have taken one single incident to talk about to introduce the background and the characters. Alison, can we have the family tree, please? Hastinapura is the capital of the kings of the Kuru dynasty. Okay, we skip a whole line of kings to light upon Bhishma, the grand old patriarch of the Kuru clan, the ultimate authority in statecraft and the canons of morality. Bhishma is not the king, he's the regent, taking care of the kingdom, while his 3 nephews are growing up, and one of them is going to become the king. And who are they? Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura. The first, Dhritarashtra, is blind. Therefore, he cannot be king according to the laws of the land in those days. The second is Pandu, who is crowned king. The third is Vidura, the best and the wisest among the 3 brothers. When Pandu dies young, Dhritarashtra becomes a de facto ruler. Vidura is his minister, whose advice the king knows is always right, but which he does not always follow. Blind Dhritarashtra has 100 sons. Don't ask me how. This is an epic. We need to know only 2, Duryodhana and Dushasana. Pandu has 5 sons by 2 wives. Yudhishthira, the righteous, Bhima, the mighty. No one can beat him in wrestling or in a combat with the mace. Valiant Arjuna, an invincible archer. Nakula and Sahadeva, the twins. The question of Himalayan proportions is this: who is to inherit the throne after Dhritarashtra? Duryodhana, the firstborn of the de facto king Dhritarashtra, or Yudhishthira, the firstborn of the crowned king Pandu? Most people see Yudhishthira, the son of Pandu, as the rightful heir. Why? He is the son of a crowned king. Secondly, he is older than Duryodhana, more than his birthright, Yudhishthira is famous for his virtues, for his righteousness, for his truth speak. And he has formidable brothers who add to his strength and give him complete loyalty. All five brothers are married to the same woman, Draupadi, a great princess. Duryodhana, as the son of the reigning king, has all the family members, plus all the allies of the Kuru clan, ministers, administrators, army generals, officials, everyone who is working in the kingdom on his side. Why? They know that Duryodhana is an evil man, but why do they support him? Because they say, we have eaten Dhritarashtra's salt, we have to support his son. But Duryodhana has two other very staunch allies. One is his own uncle, Shakuni, Machiavellian figure, and Karna, his best friend. What unites them are envy, jealousy, and the hunger for power. Uncle Shakuni knows that unless Duryodhana sits on the throne, he will not have any clout in the kingdom. And Karna hates one of the Pandava brothers, the third brother Arjuna, so much that he becomes Duryodhana's best friend because his whole mission in life is to defeat Arjuna and kill him. Duryodhana hatches innumerable plots to kill the Pandavas, but all his machinations fail. So finally, he pressurizes his father to banish the Pandavas under the pretext of giving them their patrimony. Now, the Pandavas take this patrimony, which is a wasteland, and transform it into an empire. Then they invite all the kings of the subcontinent to a great sacrifice in their magnificent capital. They have vanquished all these kings, by the way, in order to make it into an empire. And then all these kings accept Yudhishthira as the king of kings. Now, Duryodhana, who attends this function, sees Yudhishthira like a god in heaven, surrounded by his heroic brothers and his beauteous queen, Draupadi. And he sees all the kings paying homage to him. He is devoured by envy and rage. The splendor and the prosperity and the happiness of the Pandavas, he cannot even bear to think about. So he tells his uncle Shakuni on the way back home, I will jump into the fire. I will swallow poison. I will drown myself. I cannot bear to see my enemies flourishing like this. Shakuni says, oh, Duryodhana, calm down. You know that you cannot defeat the Pandavas in straight battle. They are too powerful. But I know a way of vanquishing Yudhishthira. You see, Yudhishthira has a weakness for the game of dice, gambling. But he doesn't know how to play. I, on the other hand, am a master gambler, and I know how to cheat to win. Invite Yudhishthira to play. I will win all his possessions for you. Compelled by his dearest firstborn, Duryodhana is blind Dhritarashtra's blind spot. So Dhritarashtra invites the Pandavas to this dice game, in spite of his brother and minister Vidura's dire warnings. In fact, he sends Vidura to bring the Pandavas as quickly as he can to play this game of dice. Obeying the royal command, Vidura delivers the invitation to Yudhishthira along with this gloom and doom pronouncement. Oh, Yudhishthira, Dhritarashtra has gathered all the most terrible gamblers, the desperate cheats of the kingdom, into his newly built gaming hall. They are headed by Shakuni, the master of duplicity. Don't go. Yudhishthira says, Uncle, I don't want to gamble, but I have taken a vow as a king never to refuse a challenge. Moreover, how can I disobey my own uncle, who's like a father to me? And he's a king. So Yudhishthira goes to Hastinapura with his brothers, his queen Draupadi, surrounded by his splendid retinue. When Yudhishthira enters the newly built, splendid gambling house, he sees first the grand patriarch Bhishma, the high-souled Vidura, and the venerable gurus, Drona and Kripa, who have taught the Pandava and the Kaurava boys everything they know about the martial arts and everything else as well, seated in the back row quietly. He also sees that the hall is packed with kings, glorious kings. The Mahabharata says that they look like a pride of lions. Now, these kings have been invited to watch the game. And the Mahabharata also says that every one of them in that hall is conversant with the highest truths in the scriptures. In other words, these are men who possess a profound knowledge of dharma, righteousness, and nyaya, justice. Shakuni addresses Yudhishthira. O king, the assembly is full. Let the rules of the game be fixed. Yudhishthira says, gambling is sinful. It promotes deceit. And you know, elders and scholars and the scriptures say that kings should win their possessions, their victories on the battlefield, not in gambling. Shakuni immediately retorts, in battles too, the strong defeat the weak. But if you're afraid, if you think my motives are dishonest, don't play. Don't put the blame on elders and scholars and the scriptures. Calmly, Yudhishthira says, all right, who is going to play with me? Duryodhana quickly says, I shall supply the wealth. My uncle Shakuni will play for me. It is contrary to the rules of the game for one man to play for another. But if you are bent on this, let's go, says Yudhishthira, and the game begins. As expected, Yudhishthira goes on a losing spree. Pearls and precious gems, ingots of gold and silver, elephants, horses, cattle, goats, sheep, his attendants, his courtiers, his subjects, his soldiers, his armies, his capital city, his country, all the lands that he has conquered, everything is lost in record time until the king of kings becomes a pauper. Here I should say that the Mahabharata states very clearly that every time Shakuni throws the dice, he adopts unfair methods, foul means, he practices deceit. It seems that Shakuni's greatest skill is in cheating without being detected. However, it is also clear in the Mahabharata that every single person present there in that assembly knows that he is a master swindler. Finally, Yudhishthira says, my brothers are all that I have left. And he stakes his youngest brothers, Nakula and Sahadeva. In the blink of an eye, they're gone. Now, Shakuni is afraid that Yudhishthira will withdraw from the game, so he says in a mocking tone, you were quick to stake your step-brothers, Nakula and Sahadeva, but maybe you will not stake your own brothers, Bhima and Arjuna, born to the same mother as you. Yudhishthira cries out, oh, what a sinful wretch you are to make such base insinuations. The next instant, Yudhishthira loses Arjuna and Bhima to the Kauravas. The wily Shakuni now whispers, O king, is there anything else that you have left by which you can maybe win everything back? Unhesitatingly, Yudhishthira stakes himself and he becomes the slave of the Kauravas. Before the entire assembly, Shakuni proclaims in stentorian accents, I have won the 5 Pandavas, fair and square. Then he turns to Yudhishthira, whispers to him in a very silky voice, O king, you still have one possession left, a dear possession. Stake your wife, your queen, Draupadi, and with her, win back everything that you have lost. One last stake, one single throw. The kings and the elders in that resplendent assembly shudder in horror as Yudhishthira screams in despair, I stake Draupadi, whose form and heart and mind are steeped in perfect beauty, in perfect purity, like the autumn lotus. The hall resounds with cries of shame, shame. Some freeze, others sweat, some shiver, others see tears pouring down their eyes. Vidura clutches his head as if he's lost his reason. But Bhishma, Drona, and Kripa, they remain silent, hanging their heads down. In that dead silence, in that dread silence, the dice rattle and fall. Dhritarashtra bursts out. Has she been won? Has she been won? Shakuni picks up the dice and flings it up into the sky in joy. Duryodhana, in one bound, is up to Shakuni and he embraces him as if he would never let him go. The 100 Kaurava boys and Karna, they bellow in triumph. Intoxicated, maddened by this victory, Duryodhana shouts, Go and bring Draupadi. She must clean and sweep my house now. The attendant who goes to bring Draupadi finds her sitting alone in a secluded room, wearing a single piece of cloth. That was the custom for women undergoing their menstrual periods to do. It was taboo to approach a woman in that very vulnerable condition. At first, Draupadi cannot even take in the news that he brings, though shocked and stunned to find that she, who was the queen of the king of kings, is now a slave. In the flick of a gambler's wrist, her mental courage, her inborn courage asserts itself, and Draupadi sends the attendant back to the assembly with two questions. Ask my husband, the king, whether he lost me before he lost himself. And ask the assembly if it is right to summon a woman, a daughter-in-law of their own Kuru clan, to appear in public in my condition. The attendant returns empty-handed. Now, Duryodhana sends his brother Dushasana to bring Draupadi. Dushasana runs to the Draupadi's room, grabs her by her long and thick hair, and drags her to the open court. Draupadi controls her humiliation, her horror, her rage to ask, Oh, righteous Kuru elders, great kings who are here, you have wives, mothers, daughters-in-law. How could you allow these rascals to dupe my husband and to stake me? And how could you allow my husband to stake me after he lost himself? Bhima cannot bear this. He cries out, Oh, brother Yudhishthira, I am going to set fire to your hands and burn them up. Hands which dared to stake our greatest treasure, our queen. Then Vikarna, don't confuse him with Karna. Vikarna is one of the brothers of Duryodhana. He stands up and says, I'm young, but I speak because the elders are silent. I can give you 4 reasons to say as proof that Draupadi has not been won. 1, Yudhishthira was forced to play this game. 2, she is wife to 5 brothers. How can one brother stake her? 3, Yudhishthira lost himself before staking Draupadi. 4, Shakuni suggested the stake, which is against the rules of the game. Karna jumps up and shouts, Vikarna, are you a traitor? Sit down. Draupadi was lost the moment Yudhishthira lost all his possessions. A wife is a husband's possession, isn't she? And you need not have any compunctions about dragging her to court, to this public place, though she's wearing a single garment. Why? She's an unchaste woman. She has 5 husbands. It would not be wrong to strip her completely. Dushasana stripped them all. The Pandavas remove their upper garment and fling it to the ground. Dushasana pounces on Draupadi, grabs the end of that single piece of cloth that she's wearing, and begins to strip her. Who can save her now? Draupadi closes her eyes and prays. I am sinking in the abyss of shame. O great yogi, O great soul of the universe, Krishna, my friend, save me. Now, the ancient recensions of the Mahabharata offer us 2 versions of what happened next. One is simple, most of us know it. The god Krishna saves her by extending that single piece of cloth so that Dushasana is not able to remove it at all. It keeps on getting more and more, it keeps on getting longer and longer. The other is more complex. It invokes cosmic justice, and I love this. I quote, as Draupadi called out to Krishna, dharma, which is nothing but cosmic truth, cosmic righteousness, remaining unseen, covered her person. It says that righteousness covered her person. As each piece of cloth was ripped off, another appeared in its place, owing to the protection of dharma. Hundreds upon hundreds of robes of many hues came off Draupadi, until finally Dushasana slumped down in exhaustion. End quote. Draupadi now speaks words which chill everyone to the marrow. The sinner, this sinner, grabbed me by the hair and dragged me here. My hair will remain unbound until it is smeared with the blood of Dushasana. Bhima takes an oath now, which makes everyone's hair stand on end. He says, one day I will tear Dushasana to pieces and I will drink his blood. Draupadi once again addresses the assembly and says, tell me if I am a serving maid to the Kauravas, O great members of this assembly. If you say so, I will accept your verdict. Vidura quickly interpolates. When someone who is persecuted asks for a just answer, anyone who knows the answer and remains silent is performing a lie. This assembly must answer Draupadi's question. Has she been won in the dice game? There is total silence. But Bhishma breaks this deafening silence and says, the course of morality is subtle and intricate. Even the wise sometimes fail to understand it. What a strong man calls morality is accepted. But even the highest morality, when it is spoken of by a weak man, is disdained. I am unable to answer this question, Draupadi, though it is creditable that even in your distress, you are in pursuit of virtue and truth and ethics. I cannot answer your question but I can say that the greed of the Kauravas will completely destroy them. It seems to me, however, that Yudhishthira is the authority here. Let him answer. That is how Bhishma, the patriarch, passes the buck. Rejoicing, Duryodhana says, Draupadi, let your husbands answer you. Let Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva declare that their brother Yudhishthira is not their lord. He has no right to stake them. And let Yudhishthira, the righteous, say that he is not your lord. He is not your husband. He has no right to stake you. Then you are free. As he talks, Duryodhana spreads his legs and uncovers his left thigh, making an inviting gesture to Draupadi, asking her to come and sit on his thigh. Bhima explodes like a volcano. One day I will break that tie which you uncovered before Draupadi, he says. Just then, a jackal begins to howl in Dhritarashtra's palace. Asses begin to bray. Birds of prey circle above and shriek, answering the howlings and the brayings of the asses and the wolves. Terrified by these frightful omens, Gandhari, the wife of Dhritarashtra, begs her husband to pacify Draupadi somehow. Otherwise, she says, these omens predict a cataclysmic end to their entire race. Compelled in this manner, Dhritarashtra grants Draupadi 3 boons. But Draupadi wants only that her husbands should be set free. And that is how the Pandavas find themselves riding home in their chariots with Draupadi, all their wealth restored. And the story should come to an end now. However, Duryodhana manages to convince his father, Dhritarashtra, once again that the Pandavas have been insulted so terribly that they will come back immediately with a huge army and decimate Hastinapura, kill them all. Terrified now, Dhritarashtra immediately sends a messenger to bring Yudhishthira back to the gambling hall, forces him to play. Though he knows he is going to lose, Yudhishthira sits down to play for a single stake. If he loses everything once again. And in addition, he must exile himself and his brothers and Panchali and Draupadi to the forest for 13 years. Shakuni's win is, of course, a foregone conclusion, and the Pandavas once again discard their royal garments and prepare to go, start walking to the forest. Draupadi, still clad in her one single piece of cloth, her thick, long tresses hanging around her like a smoldering cloud, follows them. The Pandavas walk on. 13 years. They see what is going to happen after 13 years in their mind's eye. They know what will happen. They see carnage, bloodshed in a war of revenge, where Bhima kills the 100 sons of Dhritarashtra, drinks Dushasana's blood, breaks Duryodhana's thighs, and anoints his wife's hair with their blood. Where Arjuna kills countless warriors and makes an end of Karna. Nakula kills the sons of Shakuni and the sons of Karna. And Sahadeva puts an end to the evil Shakuni's life. But as they walk on, the Pandavas do not know that along with their enemies, all their kinsmen and all their friends would die in that battlefield. And Yudhishthira will be crowned king of kings once again to rule over a kingdom filled with women wailing for their fathers, brothers, husbands, sons. Ahimsa paramo dharma sarva prana dhritam varaha. Ahimsa paramo dharma sarva prana dhritam varaha. Om Shanti. Shanti, Shanti. Thank you for listening. Now, Daniel Epstein, when I met you last, you knew this story better than I did. So now, may I request you, I'm sure as a politician, you have some fantastic insights into happenings in this big incident. Waiting to hear you. Can you launch this discussion, please?
It'd be my pleasure. Thanks so much for the introduction and for the incredible telling of the story of the dice game. I think you described it in a really important way, which is you talked about it as stories within stories, as the Mahabharata, as having stories within stories. And this is we zoomed in on the dice game, but there are stories even within this story. And one of the things that that stood out to me in learning about this story and reading the story is that everyone seems to be playing a different game. That, you know, we're focused on the dice game as the kind of the thing that animates the story, but even the dice game itself is a combination of people playing different games. Yudhishthira thinks that he's playing a game of chance, but Shakuni is playing a game of skill. And then there are other games for each of the different characters. And even Yudhishthira, who's playing this game of chance, part of his game and his goal is to kind of be a paragon of the Kshatriya code, where he's not allowed to refuse challenges. Duryodhana is playing his own game to amass power and wealth and maybe security against what he views as a rising rival power. Vidura, the advisor, is trying to prevent mass death. Arjuna is trying to maintain unity with his brothers. Dhritarashtra is just trying to kind of show off his new fancy parlor, and his goals kind of shift depending on who speaks to him last. And so part of the interesting and frustrating part of the story is that everyone is playing a different game within this game. And that makes for a really rich story. And from the standpoint of ethical dilemmas, it makes it seem very current, I think, because it feels real in a sense. And there are a number of questions that kind of came up to me while I was reading through the story, and I think they're questions that are prescient for the story, but also just in everyday life, in current events, and in my job as a lawyer, I see a lot of these kinds of questions coming up. And so I focused on 4 questions that I saw in the story. Who gets to decide? And as a gloss on that, who pays the costs for those decisions? What is voluntary? What and who is tradable? And who has a voice and who is voiceless? Those are kind of the 4 questions and that stood out to me. And the first one, who gets to decide, is one that we deal with in law all the time. Arjun may be able to talk about this a little bit as well, but this question of who gets to decide is a really important starting point. In law, sometimes we call it jurisdiction. Does a court get to decide at all? Sometimes in policy, we talk about separation of powers. Is there, this is all ways of thinking about who gets to decide. And in the Mahabharata, we see that Dhritarashtra, he and Yudhishthira seem to be kind of the key deciders in a lot of turning points in the story. Dhritarashtra gets to decide when to stop the game, although he doesn't really. He gets to decide whether to give these boons, whether to give back what was lost. Yudhishthira gets to decide whether to play at all. He gets to decide what to stake for the most part. But interestingly, he may not feel like a decider. We view him as a decider in some ways, but he might not feel like a decider. 1, because he has this intractable gambling addiction, and 2, because he has a devotion to the Kshatriya code that doesn't allow him to refuse challenges. And at times, those things kind of conspire to bring up this second question that I raised: what is voluntary? Was he even really? Did he have the ability to make the decisions that he for which he was the decider, whether to play and what to stake? And that gambling addiction is a really interesting way to view this question of what is voluntary. In law, sometimes we talk about it in terms of informed consent or undue influence, but in the Mahabharata, it takes the form of making decisions within a gambling game that he is addicted to. And then there's this third question, what and who is tradable? In the dice game, Yudhishthira starts with material goods, giving away mass amounts of material goods, but then moves on to alliances and people, servants, siblings, himself, his wife. What and who is tradable is an important question. And, in my job as a lawyer, sometimes we talk about that in terms of violations of public policy. Are you trading things that you are not allowed to trade? People being one of them. And then this last question that I think is worth thinking about is who has a voice and who is voiceless. And in law, sometimes we talk about that in terms of non-party interests, people who have a stake in a lawsuit that they're not a party to. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of interests of parties that don't have the capacity to represent their own best interests. They don't really have their own voice, so they need someone else to be their voice. In the Mahabharata, we see it in a few different ways. We see it in Vidura, the advisor who gives really good advice but gets dismissed because that advice is not something that Duryodhana wants to hear, and he gets kind of dismissed as being a favoritist towards the Pandavas. Vikarna, who seems to be a wise individual himself, gets dismissed for youth. And the servants who get traded never get a voice because they're not even there to speak. And so these four questions, I think, show up in really interesting ways that make this such a rich story. But because there are stories within stories, there's 1,000 different ways to look at it. And so I'll move over to one of my fellow panelists to expand and provide his views. And I'll remind folks that if they want to add questions, they can send questions over to the Q&A section. But with that, I'll send it over to Arjun.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fascinating and I think really spot on. So I think one of the sort of overarching themes of this epic, and Yudhisthira states this very early on, even before the dice game, but it comes to a head in the dice game and in what follows is really whether there is such a thing as a just war, whether war can ever be justified, and if it can, like under what circumstances and subject to what conditions. And I think that a lot of the ethical dilemmas presented in the Mahabharata, including in the Bhagavad Gita, in Arjuna's conversation with Krishna, really come down to this issue. I think that overall the story answers in the affirmative that there are just wars, but it's not obvious, and I think especially from a secular perspective, certainly not clear. And the second and third questions, what kind of ethical conduct is acceptable in battle, what rules of engagement are appropriate, and when it's okay to break them, I think really goes back to what Gary said initially, which is that this is a very ambiguous story and there are not clear answers. And there's of course like a school of thought that says there's no just war, and if there is, it's not necessarily seen in this story, which is complicated by a number of references in the epic to Duryodhana's reign. I mean, he's understood to be a very flawed, if not evil person, but that his reign is not necessarily a bad one, and that the people are largely content. And nevertheless, the gods are on the side of the Pandavas, and that is sort of what makes the war just, what makes their war for their reign just. And you see this sort of with the dice game provides you a couple of examples of this, of divine intervention in the dice game. There's the incidents with Draupadi's dress and with the horses and the creatures braying outside and scaring the king and queen to the point that they restore the Pandavas' rights temporarily. But from a secular point of view, I think the epic raises the question of what ethical justice there is in deposing a decent to good ruler because you have a claim on the throne, or because he obtained it through fraud, through cheating in the dice game. And if the justification for war is that it is the will of the gods, I think it raises a question that's been in the works for thousands of years, which is how far that principle goes and what specific acts can be morally justified on the basis that God wills it. And it's a big part of the story of the Mahabharata, I think, that one must follow dharma, but the implication of that is that one must sometimes fight or lie or deceive out of duty. And then it really takes a toll out of Yudhishthira, out of Arjuna, out of all of the Pandavas, and not just the Pandavas in some cases. And there's a further question on this, which is if there is a just war and you're in one, what are one's moral obligations to avoid it? And this comes up a lot especially around the time of the dice game, because at that point, I think all of the parties are really trying for various reasons to avoid war, but not all, but not everyone actually. If there is a just war, is there a moral obligation to avoid it or a moral obligation to engage in it? And the latter, I think, Krishna might actually support that point of view. One of the key points of the dice game for me is it really seems as though in several tellings of the story that this is something that Krishna and that the gods want to happen. At least one telling, I know he goes to Bhishma before the game because he's seen what's going to happen and says, whatever you see, whatever's is said during the game, I don't want you to intervene. And then Krishna who's on the side of the Pandavas, wants them to be cheated so that they can grow in exile, so that they can ultimately fight and win the war. And he instructs Bhishma not to intervene for that reason, which is, you know, for someone who knows how the future is going to turn out, it's a sort of, it presents a very interesting moral dilemma, which is, how much suffering are you going to allow so that you know, so that the end will ultimately hopefully justify the means. I think there's, Gauri mentioned the character of Karna early on as well. And I think there's a very interesting moment when he finds out his parentage, and he finds out from Krishna. And it turns out that Karna, who always believed that he was the son of a driver, is actually the oldest of the Pandava brothers, and which takes him from being a driver's son of, you know, low birth to a Kshatriya and the putative heir to the throne. And, you know, and once he knows his parentage, Krishna knows it too. And they both speak to each other and they agree to keep it a secret, which I found a fascinating moment, because they both know that it's clear that if that happens, both the Pandavas and Duryodhana would seat him the throne. And Karna, you know, he says no, ostensibly out of loyalty to Duryodhana, because Duryodhana is his best friend and brought him up from what he felt was nothing. But they both confront the fact, and Krishna, of course, he wants the war to go forward, and he wants the Pandavas, the other Pandavas, to take the throne. But they both confront the fact, I think, that really millions of lives could have been saved by releasing the information of Karna's birth, because it would have stopped the war, even at a very late moment. And they choose not to do so for their own reasons. And at least, you know, from Krishna's perspective, I think this is not to say that this is wrong, because, you know, sometimes it's arguable. I think the issue is presented in this epic. If you begin from the premise that the war is just, it's not much of a leap to argue that the war is necessary. And if it is necessary, is your ethical obligation to try and avoid it anyway, because it's a war, because many people will die, or do you have an obligation to engage and win as quickly as possible? And, you know, going back to the dice game for just 1 second, I think the moment, you know, toward the end, where the Pandavas are called back after the rights have been restored, and Yudhishthira goes to play one round of dice with Shakuni, even though he knows Shakuni is cheating. Everybody knows at this point. Why he does this, I think, is a really fascinating question. You know, this is at a time, of course, when everybody's worried about war. Duryodhana urges this because he thinks, probably with some justification, that they're going to come back with an army. Yeah, I think at that point, there's a strong argument that that is a morally justified thing to do, given the way that it seems Duryodhana is going to rule. Yudhishthira takes a slightly different approach. He comes back and he rolls the dice even though he knows what's going to happen. And the justification for that is it's his duty, it's dharma. He's been invited to come, he has to. He has to give Shakuni one chance to play it fair. I found that an interesting choice when weighed against the possibility that an unjust ruler would rule for 13 years, at a minimum. And, you know, that I know I've probably gone beyond my time, but I do think there's a sort of similar ethical issue posed with respect to the rules of engagement. And there's a scene late in the epic where it's before the great battles, and Duryodhana and Yudhishthira are sitting down and discussing the rules of engagement, and they agree very specific ones: no fighting at night, and limited use of divine or celestial weapons against ordinary soldiers, don't strike unarmed men, no striking the legs. And those rules are on both sides quite quickly and quite soundly broken. And, you know, two of the real culprits in this are Drona and Krishna. And they both end up with a somewhat similar justification along the lines of, whether it's duty to the gods or to one's people, in war, one's obligation is to fight and win and to save the lives as many as possible by concluding the war as quickly as possible. And they both come to the conclusion that if that involves trickery or violating the rules of engagement, then that is what is necessary, because that is what ultimately is going to save the most lives. And it's a difficult argument to accept for Yudhishthira and also for us, but I think it's one we continue to have through the 20th century. I mean, Sherman marching through Georgia in the 19th century, and then the atomic bombs in Hiroshima. And, you know, as Daniel mentioned, we're lawyers, and like, I think for us, the answer to what's acceptable behavior always goes back to what the rules are. And rules of engagement are in place for a reason, of course. They prevent cruelty, they protect the vulnerable, they save lives in the aggregate. But as we see here, I mean, there are instances in the Mahabharata where a violation of rules of engagement is not presented as a question of cruelty. It can be about defeating a literally invincible, immortal foe who can slaughter millions of people in this war if you don't trick him. And in that case, is it okay to trick Drona into dropping his weapons by lying to him about his son's death to cut him down while he's unarmed? I think
Arjun, I'm gonna jump in
Sorry.
for a second, because you guys have laid out a great example of, you know, the legal and ethical side of it, and I think that, you know, let's pass it off to a literary side, just so that we can get the depth of that conversation.
Oh yes, that was the last thing I was going to say. Sorry to have gone over my time.
Shrikant.
Thank you, Arjun and Daniel, and thank you, Gauri, for that beautiful presentation. I'll speak very briefly because I'm seeing a few very thoughtful questions coming in on the chat and in the Q&A line that I hope we'll have time to get to. But I also want to thank Kalapriya for organizing this event. It's really been illuminating to hear all of these perspectives on the Mahabharata. I myself will offer just a very brief literary perspective on what is a poem, after all, and is oftentimes read as having religious or historical kinds of meanings, but those are more contested than what I would like to talk about today. Which is namely my own experience with the poem as a writer and as a teacher. I first came to the poem through what some of you may know as the Amar Chitrakatha comic book series that was very popular in India and continues to be popular in India and has come over to North America through the diaspora. So I grew up with the poem and the stories of the Mahabharata in a largely highly mediated way through these what were essentially comic books. But I found myself many, many years later during my first university appointment at the University of Chicago, encountering the Mahabharata again, these stories that I'd kind of lived inside of as a child in my fantasy world, came alive once more because I taught a course in which the Mahabharata was part of the syllabus. And teaching the Mahabharata to a very diverse group of undergraduates at the University of Chicago made me see the poem in an entirely new light. Rather than from inside the poem, which I felt like I was as a child, imagining myself on adventures with Arjuna and Bhima and others, to sharing the poem with people who felt very much on the outside of the poem. Students who were not Indian, students who came from a variety of backgrounds, who found it impossible at first to even pronounce the names of Duryodhana, Dhritarashtra, Yudhishthira, and so on. So teaching the Mahabharata itself felt like something of a dilemma in that cultural context. Which translation should I use? How do I convey the different kinds of customs and social orders of Indian culture to Western students? But the poem itself, as a narrative, as we've heard today, is a poem of dilemmas as well. Almost every major character in the poem is defined by a dilemma, whether it be Karna, Arjuna, Yudhishthira, or even in some ways Draupadi, who finds herself married to 5 men at the same time, which seems like one of the most difficult dilemmas a woman could face. These dilemmas come to a head, as Gauri has pointed out, and as Daniel and Arjun have elaborated on, in the scene of the game of dice, where questions of chance, fate, and righteous action all intersect. I think Daniel has given a beautiful kind of overview of the ways that the dice game and the poem as a whole brings to mind questions of jurisdiction, competing codes of conduct, or even legal codes. The poem is full of debates between Kshatriya and Brahminical codes of action, and questions of sovereignty over oneself, right? Does Yudhishthira have the sovereign right to confer ownership of his brothers and his wife? And questions of sovereignty over peoples and populations. And Arjun's kind of expanding of this framework to think about questions of just war, rules of engagement, and other dilemmas, military dilemmas, political dilemmas, kind of helps to broaden the scope of this this examination. I think I'll just end by observing from a literary perspective, I think what I find to be a beautiful moment in the construction of the Mahabharata, when Krishna is explaining the nature of things to Arjuna in the center of the battlefield in the Bhagavad Gita, and reveals his true nature to Arjuna. He describes himself as in a series of metaphors. And one of the quiet metaphors that is not often discussed is Krishna says, when a die is cast in a game of dice or a game of chance, I am chance. So Krishna's self-description as the kind of governing paradigm of all games of chance or of fate or of destiny brings to mind again the game of dice that set this tragic war into action. So I think I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what others on the panel have to say, and I'd like to invite you all to unmute and turn on your videos, Daniel, Arjun, and Gauri, and be very happy to answer questions or discuss further among ourselves.
Okay, there are two questions which have come up. I think you know, are you seeing the questions as I am? Have you got the questions too? All right, I'll read the first question. It seems a little long, but how, and very complicated. So any one of you can answer this. How is ethics defined? What is an ethical decision? To me, ethics is not about right or wrong, but about the reasons forwarded to justify a decision. And I think Mahabharata brings that to light. There are no definite answers in the tale because the intent is to allow us to come up with our own justifications over time. I like the word justification. What is really difficult is who comes up with these justifications? Who is involved in creating the code of conduct that justifies war? That, I think, is a central issue. Do the panelists agree? Daniel, would you like to take this?
Yeah, geez, that's a tough question. That's a hard one.
Yeah, because she says justifications, you know, over time. And justification is a word which does not have very pleasant connotations for me.
Yeah, well, I think the subtext of the word justification is that it's pretext, that you're just trying to figure out a way to get to the answer that you want. And actually, we do see that a lot in the Mahabharata. I mean, and in the dice game, we see, you know, like I said, Duryodhana kind of dismisses Vidura, ostensibly because he says, oh, you know, the Pandavas have always been your favorite, right?
Yes.
But
yes.
I think the other side of that is Vidura is giving advice that Duryodhana doesn't want to hear, and so
yes, exactly,
right. You know, the first question is, how is ethics defined? I don't feel qualified to necessarily give that answer.
Yeah.
I can tell you kind of how I think about it, which is, you know, I guess I think about it as the moment of pause that one takes in making a decision that is either not their first instinct or questions their own the decision that would be in their own self-interest, and largely related to the well-being of others, right? Should I make decision A or B because maybe one of them will be better for others or better over a different time span or those kinds of things. I mean, that's kind of how I think about it. And oftentimes, you know, whether you feel that you have an obligation to people or entities other than yourself, and how you, and then the justification part is, you know, how do you make those decisions? How do you know whether you're right or wrong? How do you, you know, assuming there's a spectrum of people who are more or less ethical, I think those are the questions that you need to ask. But I guess I'll kick it to one of my other panelists who may be better able to answer the question than me.
There is another question, so maybe we can take another question, unless you want to comment on that. Anybody wants to comment on that?
I think I might add.
Yeah.
Oh, please, Arjun, please.
Please.
I think one way of thinking about the question is that I don't think the Mahabharata offers any answer to that question. And to view the Mahabharata as a work of literature is to see how it dramatizes different ethical dilemmas, but it doesn't offer a single answer to all ethical dilemmas. And I think that one thing that's been so fascinating in hearing the other panelists speak is to see brought into crisper focus the kinds of dilemmas that different characters face and how those dilemmas actually speak very directly to us in our time. But I think that to take the Mahabharata as a kind of guidebook, as a conduct manual, or as a repository of answers to ethical questions would be very difficult.
Arjun?
The only thing I wanted to say is I think that the last part of the question, which is, you know, who's involved in creating the code of conduct that can justify war and on what basis? I think the questioner said that's the key question. I think it's a key question for me too. And it's, you know, it's one that is, you know, once that question is resolved in a society, I think everything easily flows from there. And if you say like, it's the gods, it's our scriptures, it's our holy, you know, texts, then that's an answer and that's something you can go off. If you say, you know, get Daniel and I are lawyers, if you say it's Congress or the state legislature, and then that's easy. Those are rules you can follow and the results are not always going to be fair, but they are going to be what we know of. But I think that's sort of it is the key question. So I think that's really the critical point here, and it's a critical point in this epic as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next one, which is the gaming hall was filled with people who were learned in truth and justice. Was it really such a difficult moral decision to interpret Kshatriya law and allow Yudhishthira to continue to play and lose? Eventually, everything. And then come back to lose it again. His gambling addiction may have cost so many people their dignity and lives. Arjun, would you like to answer that?
Sure. You know, I think, sorry, is there okay, great. I think that is sort of an appreciated aspect of the part of the dice game is, you know, there's a reason that this is the scheme that they came up with to get Yudhishthira's lands and territory. I mean, it is because they knew he liked to gamble, and they knew he liked, you know, whether in addiction or nothing, you know, that he liked to play dice. You know, I think that if, on the other hand, you know, it's not a fair dice game, is it? Right? You know, it's not, as Daniel said early on, it is not a game of chance. Yudhishthira thinks it's a game of chance. It certainly is not. And so I think that the ethical question of, if you see fraud happening in front of you and you don't say anything, to what degree does that make you complicit? To what degree is that unethical conduct? I think that's a fair question to ask. And, you know, then, you know, I mentioned earlier the story in which Krishna goes to Bhishma early on and says, do not intervene no matter what. You know, if you've heard that from Krishna, you know, how does that layer affect your ethical obligations watching the game? I don't know. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes this particular scene in this epic so rich.
This is also.
There's one, yeah.
This is also.
Would you like to add something, Shrikant? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. This is also something that comes up when teaching the Mahabharata at the university level to students who are not necessarily South Asian. They find some of the actions of characters in the poem to be quite inexplicable. And so even things like the extreme deference to older generations shown by certain characters, or the extreme commitment to keeping one's word, even when that word was uttered kind of casually or something like that. So when the Pandavas come home and say to their mother, look what we brought home, and their mother says, well, whatever it is, you must share it equally. And it turns out they've brought Draupadi home and they have to share Draupadi for, for their married lives. These are very difficult kinds of things for people to understand who are, say, from different cultures than South Asian culture. I think the thing that the Mahabharata shows us is that what looks like a dilemma to one person, right, from one culture might seem like completely obvious in its answer from another.
Shrikant, well, just a second. I was going to say, we did have a question from somebody. If they wanted to read the epic, what translation do you guys recommend as the best one for someone who is maybe not of South Asian origin? So,
I haven't read translations, so I cannot recommend. I read it in Tamil, or I read the Sanskrit version with terrible English translations. So, would you know any good translation?
There are many. I think Daniel and Arjun, which one did you read?
Here you go. Here's
No, but that is not a translation. That's a that is R.K. Narayan's summing up of the Mahabharata. So there is no.
That was the primary doc I used, but then I started venturing out.
The primary is like it's 1.8 million words. I think it's very difficult to get through that. Though I did go through the Samaparva for this particular section, yes. But I just wanted to comment on the Draupadi being married to those 5 men. I have a different take on most of these situations. I think Kunti made a very political decision, because Draupadi was the daughter of an extremely powerful king, and if he was on the Pandava side, the Pandavas would be strengthened beyond their imagination, I think. So I think she did not want Draupadi to be allied only to one brother, so that there would be dissension between 5. In their situation, the Pandavas had to be like 5 fingers connected to a single palm. They could not be separate. I think it was a political decision that she insisted that the girl marry all 5 so that the 5 of them would stay together.
I have to say that her being this is one of my favorite parts of the story, just because there are so many examples throughout the mythology of so many cultures of polygamy. And this is really the only one that I am familiar with of a polyandrous relationship being held up as, being the hero's story. Which I just find completely fascinating and completely unique.
And she is listed among,
I'm sorry, what?
She's listed among the 5 virtuous women from mythology, Draupadi. Along with Sita, I don't remember all 5, but Sita is one of them. And so, I mean, you can't imagine 2 women in such different situations, as Sita and Draupadi. And so completely tremendous contrast. But both of them are seen as virtuous. I think the way people looked at these things was probably very different in the past. But what shocks me in this entire thing is the silence of the people. They took the silence of the assembly. And so I made it a point to read out the translation, translate that sentence from the Mahabharata. Every single member in that assembly was conversant with the highest truths.
So let me jump in on that, because I was thinking about this as well. And let me play devil's advocate for a moment and give some credit to the scoundrels Shakuni and Duryodhana.
Yes.
And maybe take it from the viewpoint of someone who's in the court who remains silent. So maybe everyone kind of knows that this is an analog for a battle for the throne.
Yes.
And in that sense, Duryodhana and Shakuni, their plan is pretty brilliant because they're finding Yudhishthira's weakness, right? And exploiting it not only in a way that will just result in their favor, but will demonstrate that maybe his virtues aren't as virtuous as people have credited. So he's in the position he is largely because he is viewed as wise, and the Pandavas are these really strong and great warriors, but also Yudhishthira is kind of wise. So you get the benefit of both worlds, and you think Yudhishthira would be a great ruler and all this stuff. But then when you actually see the dice game go down, if you're in the court and you have to decide, who do I want ruling me? I'm not necessarily so sure that you want Yudhishthira ruling you after seeing a display like that. So when we talk about kind of the ends justifying the means in themselves may have been an end to demonstrate that he's not so wise, or at least he has this vulnerability that could result in problems for a large amount of people who don't have a voice in the outcome of the game. So maybe what's going on is just that their plan is working on two fronts. Duryodhana and Shakuni's plan is working on two fronts. One, they're actually just winning the goods, right? They're getting the result that they want. But not only that, they're demonstrating that they're more suitable leaders. Now, the problem is that they're viewed as cruel in doing it, and that they're doing it in a way with loaded dice. But Shakuni talks about this at the very beginning, before they even start the game. He kind of disclaims to Yudhishthira that there is no such thing as a game of chance, that it is the skill of the dice roller. And what you have control over, this is Shakuni talking to Yudhishthira, is the amount that you stake. And time again, the amount that he stakes is a mistake. It's a really large blunder. So maybe the people in the court are just thinking, maybe I want them to lose.
That's a great interpretation of that.
Yes.
And also, one thing I would add is that the Mahabharata is full of scenes of complicity in injustice. And it's full of scenes where characters who should know better go along with wrong actions. And so in addition to that kind of unspoken drama that Daniel is pointing out, of where Yudhishthira in some ways is showing appalling lack of judgment, right, for someone who is in line for the throne, and that the audience might simply be shocked and into silence by watching this unfold. There's also, I think the Mahabharata is full of lessons for us today to think about the ways in which righteous or just people who are knowledgeable about what is right, remain silent in the face of monstrous actions.
There are a couple more questions. In fact, three. There's a comment. Daniel's explanation reminds me of USA's recent political situation. It's an anonymous attendee. Okay. And there is a question, another anonymous attendee. If every person can take away a different aspect and ethical solution to an ethical dilemma, how can each person's personal thoughts not be contradicted with those of others? Where can each reader find common ground with others? That's a very interesting question. Shrikant, that seems to be...
Well, I'll just very briefly to that, because I'd love to hear what Arjun and Daniel have to say. But I think that the common ground of the Mahabharata is not in a single code of justice or of right action. In fact, you see, the Mahabharata itself was composed over, as you said, a period of about 800 years or longer, in which Indian society and civilization was undergoing massive shifts in its kind of legal imagination and its cultural imagination. So there is no single code over 800 or more years that can be clearly articulated in the poem. But the common ground of the poem is that it brings us together to study, to witness, and to kind of marvel at these proliferating ethical dilemmas and at the variety of solutions the characters kind of discover for themselves, sometimes unsuccessfully, sometimes successfully. But again, I think that if there's any mistake in reading the Mahabharata, which is a poem about the mistakes that people make, it would be to look to it for a clear, unitary code of conduct that we can draw from it.
Okay. Does anybody else want to add anything? Because I have a message saying that this has to kind of be wound up and we need to take the last question. Is there anyone, anything important that you want to add? Arjun, Daniel, or can we move on? Okay, the last question is, I wonder if I can ask the panelists to speak to how the ethical dilemmas that the Mahabharata is imbued with fit within the religious dimension of the poem. There is a secular dimension clearly in which we see so many human struggles, but how do they make sense, or how can these dilemmas be interpreted within the sacred dimension? Does the interpretation change? Arjun, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I mean, sorry. I think that the religious dimension of the poem, I think, is inescapable, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think that it's really important in putting a lot of the relevant actions and relevant discussions in context, because especially when you're talking about what is just, in terms of in a battle for the kingdom, I think that to me at least, it's quite clear in reading the epic that the gods have a side they've taken, and that part of the ethical moral justification for the war is that this is what the gods have willed. And so, I think that it's, in some ways, perhaps it gives a clearer guideline to some of the ethical dilemmas we see, because you at least have that answer. You can say that this is a war that has to be fought because of dharma. It's our duty to fight it, and because this is what the gods will. If you take that away, I think it's much more difficult. But I think that, like anything else, religion through the story gives you a framework for establishing and evaluating moral choices that, where things get much, much more gray if you don't have that framework. And, it's just like in life.
Absolutely. And Daniel, do you want to add anything?
Well, I'm not totally qualified. I'm quite unqualified to answer this question, but maybe I'll try to just add an interesting thought with your help, which is in reading other parts of the Mahabharata, I remember seeing a part, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but where I think Krishna, after they're exiled, wants to go to war quite quickly, and the Pandavas reject that position. And to me, one of the most interesting things in religious text is when humans argue with gods, and I don't know whether he's been revealed to them as a god at this point or not, or who knows, but he clearly has a lot of power, and the Pandavas are resisting at least his suggestion at this point, which is really fascinating to me, because it kind of sets what are the rules and obligations of humans to make decisions in the context of a divine entity. And I think some people, the answer for some people is you don't have the sovereignty, as Srikanth used the term. You don't have the sovereign right to make a decision that's contrary to a divine entity. And then other faiths sometimes say, no, you do. Let me give you some examples. And I think that's a really interesting kind of rule that's set in this world of the Mahabharata that says, there are instances where humans have argued with deities, and that really changes the way that we can view some of the ethical dilemmas and decisions that they make throughout the story. So that's just the interesting point that I'll make. But other than that, I don't know that I'm qualified to answer.
I think you made a very, very fair point. There is one more question, Alison. Do we have time?
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, there's one more question, which is, I do not know I do not know the Mahabharata well, but do the gods side with the good guys always?
I think that's a great question. And
yes, I thought so. I kept it to the last.
Yes, it follows nicely from Daniel's remarks about
yes.
humans' kind of quarrels with the gods and their debates and disputes with the gods in the Mahabharata. Because I think one interesting way of thinking about the question is that, yes, in the end, the gods do kind of favor the Pandavas, partly because the Pandavas elect to enlist Krishna on their side rather than his armies. But the thing that's fascinating from a literary perspective and probably a theological perspective is that Krishna oftentimes acts in ways that shocks the mortals in the poem. And so at times it appears to some of the human characters in the poem that Krishna is acting like a bad guy. He's doing things, he's encouraging forms of action that seem unjust to these mortals. So that's, I think, one special thing about the Mahabharata in terms of the human and the divine. It complicates the relationship far more than other epic traditions.
I really love that point, and I think, in the later parts of the Mahabharata, when the war is in full swing, you really see so much of that. You see, going back to things about the rules of engagement, on one side you have Drona, who's that General Sherman figure saying, we have to do what is necessary to protect our people and conclude this war. On the other side, it's really Krishna making those choices. Krishna is the one who comes up and says, we're going to lie to Drona about his son being dead, so that technically they don't lie. They name an elephant after his son, and then they kill the elephant. So when they say that that he's dead, it's technically true. It's just not the right person. I think there's a lot of that going on with Krishna, like throughout the war, and a lot of the people on the Kaurava side are really shocked at sort of the levels to which he stoops to win. And I think that in itself is sort of a compelling ethical question. I alluded to this a bit before, but is that in war, is it right to break the rules sometimes to bring a conflict to a quicker conclusion so that potentially millions of more people don't die? I mean, and Krishna really brings that home, I think, a lot, because he's a person you're supposed to side with, you're supposed to root for, but he does some very morally questionable things in isolation.
I just wanted to add that if you're looking at it from the sacred dimension, whatever that means, because I have grown up in that tradition, from childhood. I've been listening to the Mahabharata being told and retold by storytellers. They're hugely attended events in India. People go and listen to them narrate the story, sing songs in 5 different languages from 5 different Mahabharatas. They do it for 40 days or 50 days continuously, and we go and listen. And the difference between that and when I started reading the Mahabharata on my own, I think the difference was that they were so steeped in devotion. They see the Mahabharata as a work of devotion, and then everything is because it is destiny, fate. It is It is meant to happen on one side, and the other side is it is God's will and God's grace. God's ways we cannot understand because Krishna does such duplicitous things here, from start to finish. There's so many, and he's supposed to be a God. So this is the explanation, that you cannot question the gods, and what they do is right. Our mind is finite. We cannot understand the infinite ways of God. So there is, the questionings are, I feel, kind of suppressed there. And the interpretations that are given are, and the justifications that are made for many of these wrongdoings is usually you suffer because you have sinned in your previous birth, and you prosper because you had done good things in the past. So this kind of fatalistic and reincarnation kind of beliefs which enter into the Mahabharata, when you look at it as a devotional work, I think strips the mind of all questions, and you are prepared to accept and surrender. That's the difference, I think. I have never surrendered, but I know that is the ultimate. That's the ultimate goal.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for your insight and for joining us today, Gauri, Daniel, Shrikant, and Arjun. It's been great having you this morning. Everybody, if you are interested, we had International House was helping us promote this show. I want to thank International House, and we hope that you join us every month for Cultural Sundays. We have a program coming up on March the 7th that is Understanding the Women of South Asia Through Art, and so that's going to be an exciting show. And we have all sorts of programming. If you want to learn the tabla or learn to dance, you can email me. I just put it in the chat, Allison@Kalapriya.org. And we even have a summer day camp coming up, which is a journey through South Asia for elementary age children. So keep posted with us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.